This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Having an idea to change the way we help others is one thing. Getting it off the ground and into reality is an entirely different matter. While there are any number of amazing stories about Aidpreneurs who have bootstrapped their way to success, even those who started with no funding eventually find themselves in a place where filling the coffers is necessary to scale, pivot, or just grow. My guest for the 123rd episode of the Terms of Reference podcast knows a thing or two about funding innovation. Kim Scriven is the manager of the Humanitarian Innovation Fund. Kim is responsible for the development and management of the fund and oversees both its grant-making processes and innovation management work. Kim has been a long-standing advocate for increased investment in innovation by the humanitarian system, and he previously worked within the Secretariat of the Active Learning Network for Accountability and Performance in Humanitarian Action, as we lovingly like to call it, ALNAP, where his work focused on supporting innovation in humanitarian organizations and promoting learning around innovation. I spoke with Kim in London. And hey, before we dive into the episode, if you like what you're hearing, take a moment to open up iTunes or whatever your podcast app happens to be and click on subscribe for me. Also consider giving the show a rating because it really does help. And finally, please consider sharing this episode or the podcast on Facebook or Twitter to help others get in on making aid and development better. Now on to the show with Kim. Hello, Kim. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thanks, Stephen. It's a real pleasure.
You know, we're recording this in late August of 2016. Where do we find you sitting today?
I'm in a very sunny London. It has the feel of a slightly kind of back to school week. Everyone's returning from their holidays and the kids go back to school next week. So everyone seems to be knuckling down and focusing on the busy autumn ahead, I think.
Oh man, you're lucky that you still haven't gone back to school, I guess. Maybe that's the way it is in the United States. I'm talking to you from Bangkok right now, and all the kids went back to school 3 weeks ago. So I guess it happens differently all over the world, right? So you're in sunny London and you manage something called the Humanitarian Innovation Fund, which is, I'm particularly fascinated by this because it's one of those rare spaces that we see in the humanitarian and development world where this is the exclusive focus of a fund. Why don't you give us some background on the genesis of the fund, what it does, maybe some key bullet points that you'd like everybody to know about?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks. Well, the fund has been running within ELRA for about 6 years now. And I think where it comes from, its genesis really is around, I think, the desire that lots of people share to try and improve the way that the humanitarian system delivers in some of the world's toughest environments. I think there's a sort of culture of self-analysis and self-reflection around how aid works and how the system performs in various emergencies, whether that's, going back through the Ethiopian famine in the early 80s, through Rwanda in the 90s, and then the tsunami response, and more recently Haiti. These big crises really spark a process of reflection about how we do things and how we improve. And I think the fund specifically comes from that conversation and a recognition that for a long time, there weren't really any spaces or mechanisms that were designed to help people capitalize on good ideas and solve the problems that they were facing in structured ways. So we worked initially in a collaboration between ALNAP and ELRA with some funding from UK DFID to try and set up such a mechanism, with the focus from the start being on creating specific funding for innovation, because there really weren't. So if we're thinking back to sort of 2009, 10 now, there weren't any real cross-sectoral mechanisms to provide funding for innovation. A few agencies already had some internal funding that they would put aside for R&D and innovation, but that sort of broader multi-organization mechanism didn't exist yet. So that was our initial focus. And I think really the journey over the last few years has been one where we've recognized more and more that what makes innovation happen and flourish is a big part of that is about funding and resources, but a lot of it's around the wider relationships and cultures in and between organizations that allow people to explore new ideas, allow them to then test them in structured ways, to capture evidence, to share that, and then to sort of embark on the more political process of trying to embrace change. And so that's really impacted on our journey. And so we've evolved from being primarily focused on providing funding in quite a traditional call for proposals modality to still doing that, but also doing challenge funds at the moment around WASH and gender-based violence, where we identify specific problems and then design the actual processes to bring people around the table to solve them. And also in engaging in processes of advocacy and policy change to try and sort of see how we make the system more innovative per se.
So before we dive into those processes, what's your favorite outcome that you've been involved with or that you've seen come out of the fund over the last 4 or 5 years? Is there a particular project you funded? Is there a particular process that you've been a part of that you said, wow, this really made a difference? This is the reason why I get up every day?
I think it's been really encouraging and gratifying to see how much the system has embraced the idea of innovation, particularly around technological innovation and trying to bring new technologies to bear in the system. I think there's been a huge wellspring of interest in that over the last, I would say particularly 4 or 5 years. And that's been hugely encouraging to see that kind of reaction. And I think is leading to more resources flowing towards innovation and organizations really trying to get serious about doing innovation. That if that's in a broad sense, I think, it's also really inspiring when, on the few occasions that I do, or not as many as I'd like to, when you get to go and reach out to the projects that we're funding to go and see where the work that they're doing is actually leading to impact and improved response for individuals. And that might be, projects that I've had the benefit of visiting in India, looking at microinsurance programs, to new technology projects using mobile phones for accountability in northern Somalia. It's when you get down to the face of it and see that, it's really rewarding to see how a lot of the higher level stuff does contribute to that change within individual organizations.
You talked earlier in your introduction to it, you were explaining how the fund has evolved from, a very standard sort of call for proposals, we give you some money and it's a grant, there you go, to, a model where you're funding challenges. And I've been looking at your website, and in my background research about, the different types of challenges that you do. I'm particularly interested in talking about the scaling challenge, because that's not only something that's sort of a trending topic, but one that we're finding increasing interest in.
It's very new for us as well, so yeah, it's interesting.
Tell us about, how did you discover that process? How did you innovate being the innovator? Was it just being reflective, or was that pushback from organizations, or is there something particular that you noted about a way that you could interact with organizations to help them to realize this type of innovation?
Well, I think I'd separate out slightly the challenge around scaling and the process that we've designed. In terms of the challenge, I think it's something that we've really recognized, having been involved in funding 60 plus pilots over the last 5 or 6 years. We've really become more aware of the fact that I guess some of our assumptions about what would lead to change haven't held true, or have only partially held true. So we, I think, assumed that if you help people to do good problem recognition and then help them to be creative and come up with new ideas, and then supported them to go and test those ideas in real world settings and to generate evidence through pilots and the like, that then there would be a logical next step of where those pilots showed positive results. That led to people taking new solutions on board and integrating into their core programs, and that change spreading. And I think we found that latter part, the systems, incentives that exist in the sector are such that sometimes there are inhibitors to that kind of change taking place, whether it's a sort of not invented here syndrome that agencies don't want to take on things developed in other agencies, or whether it's about not having the right types of funding that can manage that transition, or whether it's about sometimes political blockages if a certain change threatens income for an agency, or just more simple resistance to change. We've really noticed that there are these challenges to good ideas being taken on at scale, and so that's something that we've recognized more and more that we have to engage with, but also recognize our own. We're very small. We have our limitations. We're not going to be able to achieve scale ourselves, or to fund something to scale ourselves. And in some ways, that's not really our role. If something is good enough to be used at scale, it should be coming off of a innovation funding stream and going into the core budgets of organizations or generating its own revenue. And so that's how we've come to see the problem as much more as a transition from pilot, from high risk early stage to low risk growth.
Do you have a mechanism that you build into your operation where you help to sort of manage that handover from, hey, you're kind of graduating? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so traditionally what we've done is we'll offer people will apply to us for one of our core grants, which would be up to £150,000, which is about $250,000 or maybe a bit less now. And that will be to go and do the pilot. And we'd like to see that in sort of, maybe 1, 2, maximum of 3 countries, and really testing it rigorously over a period of time to see if it works, ideally in a comparative way, which means it can be judged against existing practice and then can publish results through an evaluation or through research or an impact assessment, so on and so forth. And traditionally what we've then done is for the ones that are showing promise, we've offered them some sort of bridge funding of about £20,000 to £50,000 to go and then take that and engage in processes of communications or advocacy or fundraising to try and get to the next step. And that's proved successful in some cases, but I think it's only part of the answer. And so that's why, in our conversations with the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who are funding our scale work, we decided to look at something that would more actively step into trying to support a small number of projects to take that leap into a larger impact space.
Tell me about the kinds of organizations that are applying to you, or is it, do you find that it's big organizations that are coming to you and they want, they have a couple of ideas? Is it, small groups of people? Is it an individual? Is it just a buckshot mix of all of those? What are the kind of ideas that come to you, and what do the teams look like?
Yeah, great question. It's really, really diverse. And I think that's one of the things that keeps it interesting and fun for us, is that we're engaging with a really, really broad range of different types of actors. So that could be and often is the established big humanitarian agencies, so the big INGOs, the members of the Red Cross, Red Crescent family, UN agencies, the big for a million names are applying to us. But also it will be universities around the world, smaller local and national organizations, and also sort of, I don't know how you describe them, the more sort of entrepreneurial startup type social enterprise or non-profit organizations that are trying to sort of disrupt the existing system. And as well, less than we might hope, but also increasingly from private organizations, businesses as well. So we're open to all comers, and that's really, really interesting to see and keeps it very, very live. I think where we see the most positive or the best proposals, I think, come from where you have collaborations between different types of organization that can bring different types of skills and knowledge. So that might be a humanitarian agency working with a research institute to really rigorously test an idea, or working with a business to bring on board a new technology. So it's where there's collaborations that bridge different domains, different types of knowledge, that we see the best results. And I would also say that I think I've seen a bit of an evolution over the last few years as more organizations have expanded their internal funding for innovation. I think some of the bigger organizations are now less reliant on a fund such as ours to access funding to develop new ideas. They're more likely to be able to do that internally, to make the case internally. So we've probably seen a slight balancing towards more of those smaller organizations, which I think is a positive thing. I mean, that's quite anecdotal. I don't have any firm data on that, but that's my sense. And I'd be interested to see if that continues.
Have you been an advocate? Do you get out there and talk about the need for innovation? Do you round up donors and give a conference and say, here's the reason why it's important that you invest, et cetera?
Very much so. I mean, we recognize that even if we're super successful in our fundraising strategies, which, we've been pretty lucky to date, but who knows, we're never going to be one of the big players in the aid space per se. We're always going to be in the innovation niche. And so if we want to have the wider systemic change that make the sector more dynamic, more responsive to the needs of affected populations, and more able to respond to very rapidly changing crisis environments, that's going to require change in the behaviors and approaches of the big donors, but also the big agencies. And so that kind of engagement in the policy space, I think, is also fundamental.
Well, it sounds to me like, you've just named one of the disruptors in your line of the business, right? That potentially large organizations, they've gotten the message, the people have stopped preaching and, they're starting to set funds aside. I know on this podcast, we've talked with a number of people from large organizations and they've talked about, at least smaller or growing pools of funds to basically either be reflective, as they say, or be forward thinking in terms of innovation. Are there other disruptors coming down the pipe? I mean, I know that, for instance, like ICRC has the Humanitarian Lab in there, and there's sort of information hubs or innovation hubs. I'm thinking of like UNICEF. They have innovation hubs around the globe. Are you having to compete intellectually with them for eyes and ears, or do you find it still collaborative, or what does that ecosystem look like?
I think it's changing and it's becoming more busy, and I think that that's a good thing. I think it could probably, with any kind of new space, there's probably, lots of fireworks, lots of interesting things emerging, and there'll probably be a period of consolidation after that. But I think, in general, like, it can only be a good thing to be having more of those kinds of conversations. I would say that they need to do two things. They need to be outward looking, so that we're constantly trying to build those links that I was talking about to other types of organization, whether those are, universities, businesses, sort of volunteer technical communities, whether that's the makerspace or the digital humanitarian networks and those kind of groups. We need to consistently be trying to build those links, because we're not going to be able to answer these questions from within the knowledge and resource base that exists within the sector at the moment. And also, I think there's a challenge around, whilst we want to promote a focus on innovation and we want to promote, structured approaches to innovation in the system, that can't be at the same time consolidating innovative capacity and ideas, because it has to be a process which empowers, field coordinators, program managers, country directors to do innovation, to take risks, to access funding, to consolidate and share that learning, rather than, that's something that belongs to the innovation unit in London or New York or Geneva, because that's going to be a really negative effect, I think.
It seems like it would mirror your experience as well, where, rather than being a granting organization, you've started to expand yourself into different mechanisms and different lines of communication with organizations. Did I characterize that correctly?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as I was saying at the start, that's much more, I think, for us, a recognition that we had some quite linear assumptions about the result of providing funding, some of which have held true, others which have not. And so it's about developing a package of support for innovation to different kinds of organizations that are in different places in their journeys. And hopefully that will continue to evolve.
So what are the biggest hurdles that you're seeing right now? I mean, as a funder, you've spoken a bit about the transformation you've seen. Again, you just said, how you're placing yourself. What are the barriers that organizations see to putting innovation in place? Not only getting a new idea off the ground, but then bringing it in and making it operational, essentially.
I mean, I think it's not surprising. When we look at the traditional humanitarian sector, it's not surprising that they find innovation difficult. They're big, bureaucratic entities which are trying to work across, very diffuse operating environments and are very focused on rapid delivery of more or less standard response packages. And they've become quite good at that. But, the pressures that they've had from a range of sources, be it donors or be it from each other or be it from, the politicization of aid, has meant that they've become very focused on doing that, sometimes at the detriment of being really responsive to the information, to the data they get from the delivery of their operations. So there's a lot of broken feedback loops there, and there's a lot of inertia in very big organizations, and that doesn't create good conditions for innovation. Add to that the resource constrained, they don't have the traditional profit incentives that you'd see in business. I think we're dealing with really tricky innovation problems here that would stymie the efforts of many who might proselytize from business. It's very easy to look at the corporate sector and say, oh, they're very good at innovation. But actually, if you look at the kinds of problems we're dealing with, they're very tricky ones. So it's easy to bash, but I think we need to recognize that there's a lot of challenges there.
Well, and we would see if it was so easy for the private sector to find the solutions, they'd be there, right? I mean, they'd in full force if they had a way to commercialize the helping of people in this way.
It's a caricature, but when we're doing brokering between humanitarians and business, quite often the business will come with its product and sort of offer it to the humanitarian who will say, oh, I really like it. Can you make it, lighter, stronger, easier to use
and less expensive
price? Which is really tricky, and that's a caricature from the product space. But I think that you could map that out to a lot of processes and other areas as well. So,
take me down that private sector road. I mean, you said earlier that you're seeing some of these what you would call entrepreneurial adventures. On this show recently, a few weeks back, we had an organization called Zipline on for one. They're funded by Silicon Valley. They're stacked with Facebook and Google engineers. And they're operationalizing their own, for lack of a better term, drone that will that delivers medical supplies to remote areas. I mean, this is something that is something like that on your radar that you're able to either contribute to or seek to fund, or is that
I don't know that example, but
a new breed?
Yeah, more of those types of organisations that bridge that sort of that corporate philanthropy or that sort of Silicon Valley mindset, but also trying to apply that in humanitarian settings and to leverage new technologies. Yes, we're seeing more of that, and I can think of organisations we've funded that are able to do that. And I think where that works really well is that you've got teams that represent those different kinds of knowledge and skills that can work together and don't neglect the need for really good contextual understanding of the kinds of settings you're trying to work in. Because as we're just talking about, these humanitarian settings are very difficult places to work. And so you need to have that kind of knowledge. So, we're working with an organization called Field Ready, which we've supported, which is very much about trying to disrupt logistics and supply chain. And that bridges knowledge of humanitarian contexts and operations from people who've been working in the sector for a number of years, with links to the maker community and the sort of labs movement, as well as to academia and also to places like Singularity University. So it's where you begin to draw the dots between those different kinds of knowledge and actors that I think there's real positive space. And I think we're probably going to see the barriers to entry into the humanitarian space decreasing. Traditionally, it's very hard to become a recognized actor in the humanitarian space that has a seat at the coordination table, that's able to access the funding to work in some of these contexts, that's able to be seen as a player. I think that's going to change for better and for worse. So I think for better, it's going to allow new types of knowledge to come in. Probably it's going to raise the bar in terms of speed of response, in terms of use of technology, in terms of hopefully responsiveness to the needs of affected population. But there's also risks there. We shouldn't. There's been a lot of positive steps in terms of developing sphere standards and codes of conduct and getting people to try and more adhere to them through various voluntary accountability and other such mechanisms. We don't want to lose those pluses. So how you balance that's going to be really interesting. But I think that's something that the existing players have to engage with and through partnership and collaboration work out what that means for them.
Do you have a process for knowing when something's going to fail? Or is it completely unique every time?
We have processes and models that we have developed which try and map out the steps of what successful processes look like so that people can try and replicate them in ways that help them to achieve success. But we don't know what's going to work and what's not going to work at the outset. That when we sort of try and understand what the risks are, what the different factors are, but you're never going to get that right. If you did get it right all the time, you wouldn't actually be taking any risks, I don't think. And we would very much separate out the different types of risk and the different possibilities for failure in a project. So a project that just went out, tried to do what it was, had a very specific problem focus and was trying to develop an idea in response to that, and developed it, tested it, it didn't work, they captured that and shared it. Well, we wouldn't really consider that to be a failure. That's sort of the process of doing innovation. Like, yes, it would have been better if it worked, but if it didn't work, well, that's okay. If there's a break in the chain and that learning isn't captured and shared, well, that is more negative, because then those resources, you're more likely to repeat those mistakes again, and that's a bad thing in a resource-constrained environment. Or if it's just a poorly managed project that can't do its budgets well, those aren't acceptable kinds of failure. So it's about being clear about what we understand by success and failure for innovation projects, and then ensuring that we get the positive elements in the things that we're working with.
Begs the question: do you have some place where you are starting to store, or over the last 6 years since the fund's been around, that you've created a database of, hey, here's what we've learned, here's what we know works and what doesn't work, or here's some examples of how you can prevent some of those risks, these kinds of things?
We've been working in partnership with ALNAP for a long time, and I think we've done some really interesting work with them, doing very in-depth case studies on a number of the projects that we've funded, and then synthesizing between that to begin to understand what the factors for success and failure are. And that's resulted in a publication that came out earlier this year called More Than Just Luck. And I think actually maybe Alice Obrecht has been on one of your previous podcasts. So that's a really rich source of learning around innovation that I think we're drawing on and trying to understand better what that means for how we should be evolving. But I think for other people who are looking at doing innovation at the project level, that's a really rich source at the moment. And what we're planning to do is develop that with ALNAP a bit further to have some specific issues around looking at M&E of innovation, for example, but also begin to develop more focused tools and methods to help people who are, as I was saying before, who aren't the people in London or wherever who are tasked with the high level strategy stuff, but much more you're a program manager in Juba at the moment, and you've got problems that you don't know how to fix. What's the process that you might go through for trying to identify potential opportunities? How might you, in very rapid, iterative ways, begin to explore and test those? And then if they're successful, how would you begin to kind of make sure that's captured and shared? Very practical level stuff we'll be working on in the future.
At the risk of asking you what your secret sauce is, or what the secret sauce is there anything that you can tell us about what you look for when somebody comes to you for funding? Is it a great application? Do you is it a negotiated process? Do you have a way that you put out feelers and try to bring applications in?
The first thing I'd say is that I think we would say there's no secret sauce. We'd advocate very much for demystifying innovation and saying that it isn't, as the title of Alice's report is, it's more than just luck. There are things you can do to improve success, and a lot of those things are common sense and are not that different from the traditional sort of project management approaches that people will be familiar with. They're just more attuned to dealing with uncertainty and unknown outcomes and some of the kind of slightly different things that you get when working with innovation projects. So no secret sauce, but in terms of what we look for, there are very specific things that we want to see from people applying for us to funding, and that we set those out in terms of the criteria, and that's very much around wanting to fund things that are going to have a positive impact on people affected by crises. So trying to move away from any kind of technology for technology's sake or innovation for innovation's sake to say, well, how is this actually going to improve people's lives? We'd also want to see, a really strong approach. That goes back to what I was saying about the different types of failure. What we want to see a really clear project methodology, a really clear plan for delivery. We want to sort of balance that with feasibility, to looking things that we think have a reasonable chance of success, or a reasonable understanding of how a particular innovation is going to lead to change, and that's sort of stepping into the realm of theory of change and so on. And I think really crucially also, we're looking at trying to find first-class teams, and that's often teams that span organizations, as I was saying, to have different types of expertise, to understand what are the different sort of skills and competencies that are needed for an idea to develop, and how are those going to be brought into the team and recognizing also that those probably change a little bit through the life cycle of innovation. The kind of people that you need on board in the early stage and testing are probably different from the kind of people you need on board when you're doing your big evaluation or when you're trying to do business development and share it. So that kind of recognition I think we'd look for as well. So, hopefully none of that stuff is totally revolutionary or surprising. It should be fairly common sense stuff. But that's how we approach it.
Isn't it funny how the common sense stuff, it just always seems so hard to put pen on paper then. Having written my fair share of proposals over the years, right?
Well, I think it's the nature of the sector that everyone's stared at a blank piece of paper thinking this will be the best proposal ever. But, I think people need to start with a good idea, and a good idea comes from working on problems and understanding them. So, I often find that the spark that you associate with innovation comes with someone who's been working on a problem for ages and is unable to see a way out, ends up explaining it, talking to someone who says, oh, well, I've got an idea, and that relationship leads to an idea. And that moves forward. It's something that doesn't necessarily happen in isolation.
Yet another unwitting data point for the creative integration of relationships and networks, and as you say, pull the private sector and pull government, pull everyone at the table so that you can have those conversations. Two questions that I always conclude our interviews with here in terms of reference. The first one is, who do you pay attention to? Obviously, Alice over at ALNAP you pay attention to, but who else do you pay attention to, to keep fresh with yourself? I mean, are there blogs? Are there mailing lists? Are there places, there Twitter feeds that you go to say, I keep abreast with information to keep me fresh and to keep the fund fresh?
We're incredibly lucky to have a board which is made up of people from the humanitarian sector and business and a range of very, very diverse organizations who I'm very lucky enough to be able to talk with both at our meetings but also bilaterally, who are bringing in all kinds of knowledge, and that's a real privilege for me. So we have a guy from ThoughtWorks, which is a big software tech consultancy, a guy from the Ministry of Defence here in the UK, our chairs at the Institute of Development Studies, got someone from DFID. So we've got this really broad range of expertise, and that's a real privilege. In terms of where I go for reactive stuff, I quite like searching out things which might speak to some of the issues that we face in the aid sector, but also go beyond that. So I quite like reading Stanford Social Innovation Review, which might from time to time have some stuff that's very focused on the aid sector, but will also have much broader topics. I think their cover story over the summer was a thing on data and how you'd apply it, and that could be for a veterinary charity in the US as much as someone working in Syria. So yeah, that's the kind of thing I'd seek out. Oh, and also another thing that we did earlier in the year was I worked with Wendy Fenton at the Humanitarian Practice Network and HPG, and we worked together on an edition of the Humanitarian Exchange magazine, which was specifically looking at the issue of humanitarian innovation. And that, I think, had about a dozen articles, some from HIF projects, but also from a much broader spectrum, looking at really what's the latest in humanitarian innovation, what are some of the implications of that. So I'd encourage people to check that out as well.
My last question is one that I'm going to ask it, but I guess as a funder, you get to answer this question all the time. Is there an innovation? It could be a gadget, it could be a process, it could just be an idea. Let's say outside of the area that you normally look at, that you are particularly excited about. Something that you like to tell people over drinks or cocktails or a coffee.
Okay, yeah. So there's two things really. One thing is one that I'm just going to put my hands up and say that I don't really understand the boundaries of it or the implications of it. But
those are the best kind right there. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
I think all of this stuff around the potential for blockchain technologies and how those might be applied sound really interesting, and a thing that I've got on a sort of piece of paper saying to be learnt about, but haven't really had the potential.
I see you're a Bitcoin follower. You like the future money.
That's, I think, an interesting space. And the other thing I think is just the cost of the cost and usability of a lot of internet-ready technologies is going to come down very much over the next few years. And a lot of the associated technologies like solar are also falling in price and becoming much easier to use. And I think that's going to unlock a lot of new potential to have off-grid systems, to have Internet of Things enabled systems in camps and in very difficult to work in environments. And I think that that's going to offer us potential for real step changes in improvements in some of the systems that we rely on. So I think that that's going to be a really interesting space.
Kim, this has been a fantastic conversation, very insightful, and I really appreciate your time today. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from Aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.